It is a queer thing, but imaginary struggles are harder to bear than actual ones. At a time when people suffering from mental illness and insanity were treated as beasts, Dorothea Dix, the woman just quoted, changed America's beliefs about the mentally ill. Every single human being is unique and complex. Dorothea Dix understood that and stood up for human beings that had been disregarded by society. She was a teacher, a friend, a hard worker, and a very compassionate advocate. Dorothea Dix was born on April 4, 1802 in Hampton, Maine, which wasn't really Maine yet since that land was still officially part of Massachusetts. Her early childhood was quite unhappy, for although she lived on a farm of sorts, her father was a terrible farmer. In fact, he was not really good at keeping any job. He claimed he was a preacher, but all that resulted in was him leaving his family for extended amounts of time and not bringing home much money at all. Dorothea's mother was often depressed, and the lack of parental stability meant that Dorothea had to be sister, mother, caretaker, and provider for her family from an early age. The only bright spots in Dorothea's life were her visits to her grandparents in Boston. Her grandfather was a well-to-do doctor, and he and her grandmother lived in a beautiful, large house. Dorothea enjoyed her visits to her grandparents' house so much so that she eventually moved there. We don't know whether she ran away, was kicked out of her house, or was invited by her grandmother, but somehow Dorothea started her new life in Boston. Unfortunately, that new life wasn't as grand as Dorothea might have expected. Her grandfather sadly passed away before she moved in, and her grandmother, according to Dorothea, was too concerned with turning Dorothea into a lady. Eventually, Dorothea's grandmother shipped her off to an aunt living in Worcester, Massachusetts. There, Dorothea found the love and hominess she craved throughout her childhood and matured into a young lady. Dorothea began teaching at 14 and eventually traveled back to Boston in 1819. She set up Dix Mansion, a school for girls, and a little while later another charity school for girls who couldn't afford an education. Poor health caused Dorothea to end her teaching career, but her life did not stop there. In many ways, her life's work was just beginning. After traveling to England to relax and recover, Dorothea ended up learning about asylum reforms there. Back in the United States in 1841, she took up the job of teaching Sunday school for the women prisoners at East Cambridge Jail. Her visits there sparked compassion and concern in her for the poorly treated prisoners, especially the mentally ill prisoners. They were abused and neglected, forced to live in their own stink and the freezing cold. Dorothea didn't just contemplate over these terrible circumstances. No, she did something about them. She took her concerns to court and made life at least a little bit better for the prisoners. Dorothea was inspired to keep on going with this work of advocating for the mentally ill. She stood firm in her belief that man is not made better by being degraded. She traveled all around Massachusetts, visiting jails, hospitals, every nook and cranny she could find that housed those suffering from mental illness. Some mentally ill people were kept chained up and in cages. Others were left in concrete block cages outside in the cold. Astounded by the circumstances she found people in, Dorothea Dix kept records of everything she saw, and she saw pretty much everything. After presenting her memorial, collection of what she saw throughout Massachusetts, to the Massachusetts legislature, the state agreed to expand its budget for hospitals and the like. Dorothea was probably really glad about that, but wasn't content. She moved on to other states like Rhode Island and New York, traveling all over them and writing her sights, feelings, and thoughts. She acquired better situations for the mentally ill in those states and many others. She traveled all across the United States and helped many people. In those days, traveling was tough. They didn't have cars, planes, or even really trains at that point in U.S. history. Dorothea was already a somewhat sickly person, so travel was doubly hard on her. But she pushed through her own suffering to ease the suffering of others. Also, in the court system at that time, women were not allowed to speak or really use the courts at all. That's part of the reason Dorothea wrote down all her memorials. That way, her opinion could be stated in court, but just read by a man instead of herself. Dorothea pushed the boundaries of her society. Dorothea even requested that the federal government donate 12 million acres to the cause of those suffering from mental illness. Her request, named the Bill for the Benefit of the Indigent Insane, passed both houses of Congress, but was vetoed by Franklin Pierce in 1854. After that defeat, Dorothea traveled to Europe and helped along hospital and asylum reform there. She was able to research more ways to help the mentally ill and even met Pope Pius IX, who believed in Dorothea's mission and caused a new hospital to be built. Dorothea returned to America in 1856, just in time for the Civil War. Always looking for someone to help, Dorothea started working as a Civil War nurse. As she once said, "You never saw a very busy person who was unhappy." And boy, did she keep herself busy. In 1861, she was appointed Superintendent of Nurses. That was a pretty high up position for a woman at the time, especially for a woman who really had no medical background at all. Dorothea earned much respect during her time as a Civil War nurse. She treated wounded soldiers from both the Union and Confederate armies without showing prejudice. Hardworking and always looking for ways to better treatments, Dorothea accomplished a lot while she was Superintendent of Nurses. However, Dorothea was not the most easy person to work with, as many of her nurses, one of whom was Louisa May Alcott, could attest. Many of her nurses disliked her because of her cold demeanor. Dorothea got a lot done, but was not known for being a people person. After the war, Dorothea returned to her life's other calling, the mentally ill. She traveled a little bit more, checking out the asylums, especially southern ones, to see how much the war had affected them. Unfortunately, Dorothea caught malaria and became too feeble to continue hardcore travel and work on behalf of, as she called them in her bill to Congress, the indigent insane. Dorothea lived out the rest of her life in one of the hospitals she influenced 40 years earlier in New Jersey. She died on July 17, 1887. Dorothea Dix, advocate, friend, helper, lived her life for the benefit of those suffering from mental illness. She underwent much illness herself. She physically was in poor health for many portions of her life, but also may have suffered from bouts of mental illness as well. We can't know for sure, but maybe the suffering she endured throughout her life pushed her to ease other sufferings. She grew up in a broken home, probably often hungry, cold, and unhappy. She dealt with sickness and disease, but she gave up comfort to travel all over the United States in order to help those who could not help themselves. Although she may not have been the easiest person to work with, the work she accomplished in her life affects so many aspects of America today. Dorothea founded hospitals and asylums across America's eastern states, helped many soldiers survive the Civil War, and most importantly gave new lives and reputations to those suffering from insanity. Dorothea Dix has been honored in many ways by the United States. Hospitals claim her name, she was on a 1-cent stamp, and even a U.S. ship was named the USS Dorothea L. Dix after her. Although her tombstone simply says, Dorothea L. Dix, her friend Dr. Charles Nichols said of Dorothea, "Thus has died and been laid to rest, in the most quiet, unostentatious way, the most useful and distinguished woman America has produced." Dorothea strived to be useful, and she is still remembered today as one of America's most remarkable women.